Hi, this is section 5.5 on trigonometric graphs. So now we're looking at graphs for sine and cosine to start with. So there's a couple things that we need to know. One is the amplitude and the other is a period. So they give us some formulas. All right, so let's start with the first one. So they first ask us to find the amplitude and the period. So the amplitude for this will be the square root of a, which is the square root of 4 in this case, which is 4. The period is going to be 2 pi over absolute value of b, which is 2 pi over 1. The coefficient of, so here's your a is 4. Your b is your coefficient in front of the x, which is 1 in this case, which is just going to be 2 pi. So now we found the amplitude and the period. All right, so our graph is, we're going to start it at 0, and we're going to go to 2 pi, because that's the period, 2 pi. And then we're going to find a midpoint. The midpoint between these two is pi. And then we're going to find another midpoint between these two. The midpoint between 0 and pi is pi over 2. And then we're going to find one more midpoint. The midpoint between pi and 2 pi is 3/2 pi. And the amplitude is 4, so we're going to go up 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, and so now we can use our unit circles. You substitute 0 into x. The sign of 0 is 0, and then 0 times 4 is 0. Plug in pi over 2 for x. The sign of pi over 2 is 1. 1 times 4 is 4. The sign of pi is 0. 0 times 4 is 0. And so on and so on. If you substitute 3/2, look at your unit circle. The sign of 3/2 pi is -1. -1 times 4 is -4. And back to 2 pi, which is going to be 0. So that's what our graph is going to look like for that problem. All right. For this one, let's do the same thing. The amplitude is going to be 1 this time is your a. Your b is -4. So your amplitude is going to be 1, and your period is going to be 2/4 is 1/2. All right. So this time, it's going to be condensed. Our graph is going to go from 0 to pi over 2 this time. So it's going to be shortened. You still need to find the midpoint. So you need one midpoint in between, which is pi over 4. You need this midpoint, which is going to be pi over 8. And then you need this midpoint. So the way you find midpoints is you add the two numbers and you divide by 2. So let's add pi over 4 and pi over 2. This is how you find midpoints. We're looking for the midpoint between pi over 4 and pi over 2. So we add them. And then we divide by 2. So the LCD would be 4, so times 2 times 2. That's going to be 3/4 pi, 3/4 pi divided by 2, which is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So you get 3/8 pi. So 3/8 pi. Once you found your 5 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, your 5 angles, and you're just going around the unit circle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So for sine, it's 0. Are we doing sine or cosine? We're doing sine. So for sine, it's going to be 0, 1, 0, -1, and then back to 0. So for the first angle, it's going to be 0. Well, let's do the amplitude. The amplitude is 1. So we're going to go, sine starts at 0. And then for the first angle, it goes to 1. And then the second angle goes back to 0. And then it goes back to, and then it goes down to -1. And then it goes back to 0. So this is what your sine wave will look like. So once again, it was 0, 1, 0, -1, 0. Because 0, 1, 0, -1, back to 0. So that's why you need 5 angles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, now we're moving on to cosine. It works the same way. So let's start with the amplitude. The amplitude is going to be, that's your A is 1, B is 3, the value of 1 is 1, 2 pi over absolute value of B is 2 pi over, it's going to be 2/3 pi is your period. So we're going from 0 to 2/3 pi. Now we got to find the midpoints so that we can have 5 total angles. So the midpoint, remember what we do is we add the 2 angles and divide by 2. So if you do that, you're going to get 2/6 pi. So remember you would do 0 plus 2/3 over 2. That's going to be 2/3 over 2. Multiplied by the reciprocal, 2/3 times a half. Oops, you get 1/3. Sorry, that was, oh yeah, that is the same thing. 2/6 is 1/3. So let's change that to 1/3. I just didn't reduce a fraction. Then the midpoint between 0 and 1/3 is going to be 1/6. All right, and now we got to find one more midpoint. That would be the one that's in between pi over 6 and 2/3 pi. So let's do the math there. The midpoint is going to be the sum of pi over 6 plus 2/3 pi divided by 2. LCD is 6. So that's going to be 4 plus 1 is 5. 5/6 pi over 2, which means multiply by 1/2. And you're going to get 5/12 pi. All right, cosine is a little different. The amplitude is 1, so we're only going to go up to 1 and down to -1. So cosine starts at 1 and then 0, -1, 0, and then back to 1. So cosine starts at 1 this time. So at 0 degrees, you're starting at 1, then you're going to 0, then you're going to -1, then back to 0, and then back to +1. So that's what that would look like. Okay, for the next type of problem, this time there's going to be what's called a horizontal shift. So they also call it a phase shift. Depends on the book. A phase shift is the same thing as a horizontal shift. So the formula for that would be -c over b. We already know that the period is 2 pi over b and the amplitude is a. So I'm going to show you a different way to do these, which is a little easier in my opinion. We're going to use this inequality, and it's going to make this a little bit easier. We still know what the amplitude is. It's the absolute value of 3, which is 3. And the period we can still find by doing 2 pi over absolute value of b. So here's your a, here's your b, and here's your c. So b is going to be 1, which is 2 pi. So we have our period is 2 pi, we have our amplitude is 3. Our phase shift, I'll show you how to find the phase shift. You could do c or -c over b if you'd like. That's a fine way to do it. So let's do it that way. The phase shift is going to be -c over b. All right, so we have amplitude, period, phase shift. All right, so the other way I was going to recommend to do it is you take the argument. This is called the argument, this part, the angle, and you place it between 0 and 2 pi in a compound inequality. So let's do that for this problem. So you got 0. The argument goes in between 0 and 2 pi. And then you solve for x. So to solve for x, you would subtract pi over 6. You will end up with -pi over 6 less than or equal to x less than or equal to. Well, 2 pi is the same thing as 12 over 6 pi. That's the same thing. And if you subtract, you're going to get 11/6 pi. So this is nice because now you know where your graph starts and where your graph ends. So the starting point is -pi over 6, and the end point is 11/6 pi. So we're going to start over here. negative pi over 6. And we're going to end all the way at 11/6 pi. And then we need to find our midpoints. So there's a total of 3 midpoints. So one that's here, here, and here. 3 total midpoints so that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 angles total. So let's start with the first one. So remember what we do is we add and divide by 2. So negative pi over 6 plus 11/6 pi is equal to 10. When you divide by 2, that's really the same thing as multiplying by a half. So you're going to get 5/6 pi. All right, let's find the midpoint between these two now. So add them. And you end up with 4/6. Multiply by a half, that's the same thing as dividing by 2. And you're going to get 1/3. So that's going to be 1/3 pi. Finally, the last one is the midpoint between these two. So I'm going to create a little bit of space here and do the same thing. Add and multiply by a half. So 5/6 plus 11/6 is 16/6 times a half. That's 8/6, which simplifies to 4/3 pi. All right, and because we have a sine graph, sine starts at 0, and the amplitude is 3, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, negative 3. Sine starts at 0, and then it's going to go up to the amplitude, then back to 0, and then negative amplitude, and then back to 0. So that's how you would graph. As you can see, there's a phase shift, a horizontal shift, because it usually starts at 0, but this time it starts at negative pi over 6, which we already knew because we used the formula negative c over b, which is here. All right, let's look at another problem. So now we're going to do the same thing, but for cosine. So let's start it off the same way. The amplitude is, there's your A, there's your B, there's your C. Absolute value of negative 4 is 4. 2 pi over absolute value of B is going to be 2 pi over 2, which is pi. Phase shift is negative c over b, which is negative pi over 3 divided by 2, which is negative pi over 6. All right, so we got the 3 things that we needed. But now let's do it the other way that we learned earlier. You're going to put the argument in between 0 and 2 pi. So you always do that for sine and cosine. Then we need to solve for x. So subtract pi thirds. Subtract pi thirds. So we're going to have negative pi over 3 less than or equal to 2x less than or equal to, well, 2 pi is the same thing as 6/3 pi. So when you subtract 6/3 minus 1/3, that's going to be 5/3 pi. And lastly, we have to divide by 2, which is the same thing as multiplying by a half. So if you do that, you're going to end up with negative pi over 6 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 5/6 pi. So I like doing it the inequality way because it's easier to see your start, where your graph starts and where your graph ends. So let's draw that. So negative pi over 6 would be here, and 5/6 pi would be somewhere over here. And once again, we need to find 1, 2, 3 midpoints. So the first midpoint, add pi over 6, negative pi over 6 plus 5/6 pi. You get 4/6 pi times a half. You get 2/6, which is 1/3 pi. The next midpoint would be adding these two and multiplying by a half. Negative pi over 6 plus pi over 3. Common denominator is 2 times 2, which is 6. So you're going to get 1/6 pi times a half, because that's the same thing as dividing by 2. You get pi over 12. And then the last one is the midpoint between pi over 3 and 5/6 pi. So let's do that. Pi over 3 plus 5, 6 pi times 2, that's 5 plus 2 is 7, 6 pi times a half is 7/12 pi. All right, cosine. So our amplitude is 4, so that means we're going to go up 4, down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, negative 4. So remember, cosine starts at 1, 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and back to 1. So if you have 1 times negative 4 is negative 4. So you're actually going to start down here for your first angle. And then you're going to go to 0, and then positive 4, then back to 0, and then negative 4. And there is your cosine graph. So if you have a negative coefficient, you're going to start at the bottom. If you have a positive coefficient, you're going to start at the top. That is the end of the section.